What if I told you that a fee so small it looks like a rounding error could cost you more than a house? 0.03%. That's 3 cents for every $100. Sounds like nothing, right? By the end of this video, you'll understand why that number is quietly stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from retirement accounts all across the country. And the crazy part? It's not even the fee itself that's doing the damage. All right, let's start with something every index fund investor thinks they understand, but most don't really. The expense ratio. You've seen it. It's that little percentage on the Vanguard or Fidelity page. For something like VT Vanguard's total stock market fund, it sits around 0.04%. For Fidelity's equivalent, it's literally zero. No fee at all. Free. And if you're a millennial who discovered fire content on Reddit or YouTube, you probably picked your funds based on this number. Lowest expense ratio wins. Game over. Simple. But here's where it gets sneaky. The expense ratio is the fee you can see. It's disclosed. It's on the front page. But funds have another layer of cost that is much harder to spot. And today we're talking about the two biggest ones. Tracking error and securities lending rebates. Neither of these shows up in that shiny headline percentage, and together they create what I call the phantom expense ratio. Let's start with tracking error. An index fund is supposed to mirror an index. If the S&P 500 goes up 10%, your S&P 500 fund should go up 10%, minus that tiny fee. But in reality, funds don't perfectly match their index. They drift. Sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. That gap between the index return and the fund return, that's tracking error. Now you might be thinking, how does this happen if the fund is literally just copying the index? Great question. There are actually several reasons. First, funds always hold a small amount of cash for redemptions. That cash doesn't earn market returns. This is called cash drag. Second, for massive indices with thousands of stocks, funds sometimes use a technique called sampling. Instead of buying every single stock, they buy a representative subset. That introduces small deviations. Third, when stocks enter or leave an index, the fund has to buy and sell to adjust. That triggers transaction costs and spreads. All of these eat into your return, and none of them show up in the expense ratio. Now here's a real example. A well-known study looked at S&P 500 funds over a multi-year period. The average tracking error was about 0.07% per year, on top of the expense ratio. So a fund charging 0.03% with average tracking error is actually costing you closer to 0.10%. Now 0.10% still sounds small. But remember, we're talking about compounding over decades. Let's say you're 30 years old. You invest $500 a month. You do this for 35 years. At an 8% annual return, you'd have about $1.5 million at age 65. Now let's add a phantom cost of just 0.07% extra per year from tracking error. Your effective return drops to 7.93%. Over 35 years, that tiny difference costs you about $48,000. $48,000 from a fee that doesn't even appear on any document. But wait, we haven't even gotten to the second phantom cost yet, and this one's even more invisible. Securities lending, here's how it works. When you buy an index fund, the fund holds all those shares. But those shares don't just sit there. The fund manager lends them out to hedge funds and institutional traders who want to short stocks. In exchange, those borrowers post collateral and pay interest. This generates revenue for the fund. Sounds great, right? Free money. But here's the question. Who gets that money? This is where it gets really interesting. Different fund companies handle this differently, and the split is not always disclosed clearly. Some funds pass most of the lending revenue back to investors. Others keep a significant chunk for themselves. Vanguard historically has returned a large portion to fund investors. iShares and some others keep more. But here's the twist. Securities lending revenue can actually offset the expense ratio, meaning a fund with a higher stated expense ratio might actually be cheaper in practice because it rebates more lending income. Let me say that again because it's that important. A fund with a higher advertised fee can end up costing you less. This is the phantom expense ratio in action. The number on the website tells you one thing, reality does another. Now let's bring it all together with the big number I teased at the start. $340,000. Imagine two investors, both 25 years old, both investing $600 a month for 40 years, both getting a 9% gross market return. Investor A picks funds with minimal tracking error and strong lending rebates. Total phantom cost, 0.02%. Investor B picks funds based purely on the lowest advertised expense ratio but ends up with higher tracking error and weaker lending rebates. Total phantom cost, 0.15%. After 40 years, Investor A has about $3.4 million. Investor B has about $3.06 million. That's a $340,000 difference from costs that never appeared on a single page of any prospectus. So what do you actually do with this information? I'm not going to sit here and tell you to go analyze securities lending disclosures for every fund you own. That's miserable and nobody wants to do that. Here are 3 practical takeaways. 1. Don't obsess over the difference between 0.02% and 0.04%. That's noise. The bigger levers are saving more, investing consistently, and avoiding high-fee, actively managed funds. 2. When comparing similar index funds from different companies, look up something called the tracking difference. Morningstar publishes this. It measures the actual return gap between the fund and its index over time. This captures tracking error and lending rebates in one number. 3. Stick with broad market index funds from companies with a reputation for investor alignment. Vanguard's mutual ownership structure, for example, means they have less incentive to skim lending revenue because the fund investors are the owners. None of this means you need to panic or switch funds tomorrow. If you're invested in low-cost, broad index funds, you're already ahead of most people. But understanding these hidden costs means you can make better decisions going forward. And over 30 or 40 years, better decisions compound into hundreds of thousands of dollars. The fee on the label is the fee they want you to see. The fee you actually pay is the one that matters. If this was helpful, there's more on the channel about building real wealth without the Wall Street nonsense.